Welcome to Hope is Here. Have you ever thought, I wonder if God ever just gives up pursuing people? And I've shared my story before that my dad did not become a follower of Jesus till he was 50. And yet, so many people I know, you pray for people, and yet God's always working behind the scenes. And I'm excited today. The guest that we have over the next couple programs is Greg Howard. Besides having a great first name, he has got a background of 42 years in the criminal justice system. And so you're going to hear a lot of good stories over the next couple of days about how God's worked in his life, both personally, professionally, and now as he's entered, quote, retirement from criminal justice, he's bringing hope to a lot of people that are incarcerated right now. So I hope that you'll make sure that you're with us over the next couple of days, because I know you're going to be blessed as Greg Howard is our guest. Greg, talk to us. How did you decide to get into criminal justice?
Well, thanks for the opportunity, first off. And Greg, you're right, it's a really cool name. So I'm happy that. But you may have trouble remembering it, right?
That's right.
It's weird how I became a police officer. I really left high school to be a zoologist. And so I ran off to Murray State, really not prepared for that, and basically flunked out after one semester. So I came home, and my parents didn't have a lot of extra money to throw at that, so I went right to work. And I started going to a college there in Frankfort at night school, really just trying to work and go to college. And I met a bunch of police officers that I really liked, and started doing some sports stuff with them. And then next thing I knew it, they were recruiting me to be a policeman, and kind of the rest is history there. And so it took a little while, and that's back in the 70s. So that's kind of how I really got started. I didn't grow up like a lot of guys wanting to be a police officer. So.
All right. So when you started, did you actually start in Lexington, or where did you start your police career?
No, I started here. I applied at, actually I was recruited to be a Kentucky State Trooper. And during that time, they were in a hiring freeze. And so the advice that I received was just get on someplace and get you some experience. And then when we come calling, you'll have that under your belt. And so I applied at a variety of different places. And Lexington hired me in 1977. And I stayed there my whole career, really my whole active police career. And I loved every minute of it.
Share a little bit, obviously, start at the bottom, but as you share about some of the progression throughout your career, some of the different areas of responsibility that you had.
Yeah, it's Lexington Police Department. The reason I stayed because it has the many opportunities for a person to get a lot of different experiences, and everybody starts off after basic training and patrol uniform. So you work the street for ever how long you work the street, and then I did a lot of undercover narcotics work back in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. So I did several different tours in the narcotics division as a detective and as a sergeant and as a captain in charge of it. And then I worked in community services for a while. When I first got promoted to sergeant, the chief of police asked me at the time was a guy named John McFadden. He said, Greg, where would you like to go? And so I said, well, Chief, I'd kind of like to stay in the detective bureau. I was working in the burglary unit at the time. And he said, well, man, I really think you'd be good in community services. Well, really nobody wanted to go to community services, right? And so, it's just whatever. So he said, you go home and talk to your wife about it, and we'll come back and we'll talk about it on Monday. Well, I thought that was an option for me, right? So we talked about it, and Keenan and I both said I'd just go back to the street and work, even though I was going to midnights for that. And I went back and said, Chief, I really appreciate the opportunity, but I think I'd like to go back to the street. He goes, I'm thinking community services is good for you. So the bottom line is he put me in community services where I really found some good stuff. And as it turned out, Ray Larson had decided, and he was a Commonwealth attorney at the time, he decided that he was going to investigate the DARE program. So the Chief McFadden had that in mind, I think, and he chose me for that. And so I went off to L.A. and spent 2 weeks with the LAPD learning how to do DARE, and then came back and actually the first DARE officer in the state of Kentucky, and I'm fairly certain the first local police officer east of the Mississippi that involved DARE, and of course it's still going today in most communities. So I spent some good time there, and I got promoted to lieutenant. And during my lieutenant days, I was at I ran the horse patrol and the canine unit, and then had two housing authority unit police officers groups, and we worked both the larger housing authorities, and went to the FBI National Academy during that time, and then came back and got promoted to captain and worked a patrol shift for midnights, and then I finished up my career as a captain in charge of the detective bureau. So
wow, when
I retired, that was my local police history stuff. It's good. It's all really good, very helpful for me. Very beneficial.
Talk a little bit, I think, if my memory serves me correctly from a conversation a few weeks ago, you also worked some with, I think Ray Larson had put together a unit with the gangs, trying to kind of look at that aspect of things. Is that right? Or?
Well, so when I left the police department, I've had a couple other police jobs, but to fast forward to that, Larry Roberts is the county attorney, and Larry, I left the job in Frankfort, and Larry called and offered me a position at the county attorney's office, and he had agreed to operate a gang enforcement job out of the county attorney's office that would work with the police department and with the jail. And Larry knew I had left this job in Frankfort, and he knew me since my early days in the police world. And he called and offered me that job, and I don't think either one of us really knew what that meant, but I agreed to do it. And I was really interested in it, and that lasted 10 years. And Larry Roberts was a wonderful guy to work for and really very creative when it comes to that. So my job was to work with the police department, with the jail, to identify criminal gang members in the city and surrounding areas. So that's where I just retired from.
Okay. All right. Well, let's talk a little about your spiritual journey. You shared about your professional background, very diverse, and did a lot of different things there, very exciting stuff that I know a lot of people always kind of wonder, hey, what's it like for guys that serve in the police? But talk a little bit about your spiritual journey. I know that you believed in God, and I think my memory serves me correctly, your wife had a pretty strong faith, and so you were kind of maybe like a lot of guys kind of coattailing on that. Is that a fair description?
You mean dragging our wives down? Yeah, that's probably me. Well, the short version is I didn't really have any faith of sorts before I became a policeman. My mother died when I was really young. And so that whole side of my family spent a lot of time in church. And when I was young, I would go with them. But now when she passed away, we kind of got away from that a little bit. And my dad remarried my stepmother, who was wonderful and really strong, great woman. And she took me to church some, but it was difficult for her to do. It just wasn't that well received. And so I didn't have any to speak of. If you'd asked me if I believed in God, certainly I would have said yes. But I got baptized at the Vacation Bible School in Frankfort, and the only thing I remember about that baptism was they served Frisky Big Boys during that week. And that's what I remember most about that. It's pitiful, I know. But so anyway, when I became a police officer, I was fortunate enough to kind of buddy up with the guy that was an informal police chaplain for us at the time, a fellow named Tommy Howard. And he and I became really good friends, and actually until the day he died here just recently. But I think Tommy invested in me a lot, really was helpful. So if we're going to look at a man kind of person that was really helping me a little bit grow, it would have been Tommy. And we did a lot of stuff together. Back in the early days, we did a lot of Christian things at the police department, things called Brotherhood and Blue. We did marriage courses and those kinds of things. And Tommy, I always teamed up with him, but I still was just playing it. I still felt like I was a good person. I was making it because I was a policeman and I was helping people, and I wasn't being mean or any of those kind of things. And I wouldn't do anything real bad, but to have a relationship that come many years later, really.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. You had a conversation with your pastor one day. It was kind of challenged you on where you were with things, didn't it?
It did. When I met my wife, and we've been married going on 34 years, and when I met her, she was a member of Centenary United Methodist Church, and I was not a member of any church. And so I started going with her really just because she was tugging at me to go mostly. And then I started going more because I liked the people, right? But I never did really go based on I wanted a personal communicating relationship with God through Jesus Christ. I didn't do that. And so I had a little spiritual rough time for myself, and back in 2001, and Keen, my wife, just kept after me, man, go talk to the pastor, go talk to the pastor. And I said, I'm not doing that, man. I'm not doing that. That's not me. I'm way too tough for that. So there was a lot of men would probably say, right? A lot of guys relating to this. Yes. And so she just kept on, man, in real subtle ways, not over the top. And David was kind of new to our ministry at the church at the time, but I agreed to do it mostly just to say, okay, I've done it, check, right? So I had two specific things that really bothered me that I prayed about every night that I felt like were terrible, and they were bad. And so we're in a conversation, and I could just feel the layers being stripped away, man. Just, you know how it is sometime in a healing process. Sometimes it's instantaneously, and other times it's layer by layer by layer. And I felt that, and he said, well, let's go in and at the altar in the sanctuary and pray. And so we did. I agreed to do it, and I wanted to, but I didn't really expect much. And he goes, well, what do you want to pray for? And I said, well, look, there's these two things, man, I've been praying about. And I know he wanted to smack me, really. And he looked at me and said, have you asked for forgiveness for those two things? And I said, yeah, for 20 years probably. You don't have to do that anymore, man. And so when he said that, for some reason, the Holy Spirit just jumped all over me. And I had my eyes opened. You know, it's like when you start reading the Bible and you don't have a relationship with Christ, it's sometimes difficult to get it. But when your relationship, it's more personal, then the words kind of jump off the page at you. And when that night, the words just started jumping off the page at me. And I went from being a person who knew about God to a person who knew God. Mm. And then I was more desperate for more from that point forward as I am today. I mean, before that, I would have been, I'm not going to do anything bad, but I'm not desperate for the Word of God, unlike I am now.
Mm. I love that. Well, I've shared this on our program several times, Greg, over the past year and a half that we've been doing Hope is Here, that one of the things I've learned in both full-time and bivocational ministry is that people are harder on themselves than God is. Mm-hmm. You said you've been praying those prayers, asking for forgiveness, but still had a hard time believing that God really could forgive you. Is that fair to say? Or?
Yeah, it's a horrible thing, man. God forgives you for those kind of things. And we had that conversation a lot in prison ministry with people, because people who are incarcerated, man, they cannot see where God will forgive them for all the bad things they've done. And so we spend a lot of time saying, man, grace is free. I mean, you can take it if you want, And if I wish I had been, of course, if wishes were horses and beggars could ride, right? So if I could go back to the 70s, and I really wish I had been a real follower of Christ when I started the police department, because I'd been a much better policeman. And we try to relay that now. I'm in constant involvement with the current police chaplain here and in many other places. And we have that conversation a lot with younger police officers today. And they're getting it. They're getting it a little more than I did. So I'm pleased about that.
Well, that's one of the things we had Chaplain Donovan Stewart on about a year ago, and he was sharing a lot of the good things that God is doing because, man, you see a lot of horrific things when you're a police officer, don't you?
Well, the tragedy, I did actually written a note about that the tragedy that a police officer sees over a long period of time is tough stuff, man. It's just terrible things that no person should have to see or deal with. But yet, police officers are there to stand between good people and evil people. And they do see a lot of bad stuff. And so if they have, and it's nice to have a chaplain like Donovan to go to. Donovan and I are friends. We talk regularly, and I respect him, and it's a hard job he does. But to have a person to go to like him that can decompress some of that with an officer is really helpful.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but we were going to continue our conversation with Greg Howard. He just completed 42 years in criminal justice, but God's been doing some really good things, bringing hope to a lot of people in prison through a ministry called Alpha. And so we're going to be talking about that and a special relationship that he developed with a guy that was kind of a game changer for him. So I hope that you'll join us again tomorrow. Maybe invite somebody to listen as we continue our conversation with Greg Howard on Hope is Here.
CMI is your full-service human resources provider in Central Kentucky. For 15 years, CMI Human Resources has taken great pride in helping organizations and people work. Whether it's employee handbooks or help in filling a position, no job is too large or too small for CMI. Contact the professionals today at CMI Human Resources, 859-296-2800, or online at cmiconsulting.com.